And now I'd like to introduce Will. Will Toor joined the Polis administration as executive director of the Colorado Energy Office in January of 2019. Prior to that, he spent 6 years at SWEEP. I used to be able to walk down the hall and say hi and ask him questions, which was a lot of fun. And 15 years in local government as Boulder Mayor and Boulder County Commissioner. He has a PhD in physics from the University of University of Chicago. And despite having a PhD in physics, Will is a super cool guy. Actually, I really love physics, but you might think that makes him a nerd.
It does.
Oh, you're going to stand up? You can sit. You're all mic'd up?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. And here's a fun fact. Will has called Colorado home ever since 1980, when at the age of 18, he got stuck in Boulder while hitchhiking from his hometown of Pittsburgh on his way to the West Coast. And let's see if I can, where's Jeremiah? Are you back there? Can you just turn the screen off for now? Because Will's not going to use any. I don't know how to do that, so that's okay. And you can tell about the funner fact if you want. why are you in a walker and stuff? And please welcome Will Toor.
Well, it's great to be here today. I don't get out of the house too much these days. As Neil was alluding to, my wife and I fell about 1,000 feet down a mountain last July, and I'm still recovering from a broken femur. But I'm now mobile enough to occasionally be able to go out, so it's great to be here. What I thought I would do would be to sort of start with sort of the big picture sort of policy direction that the legislature and the Polis administration have been taking and sort of where electrification fits into that, and then sort of drill down into some of the programs. So in 2019, when Governor Polis was elected and there was a legislature that was very much focused on climate action, the legislature adopted, I think, 24 different bills in the arena of energy efficiency, electrification, climate. And since then, there's probably been about another, by my count, 32 bills in the next 3 years, sort of all in that same general arena. But sort of one key step was the passage of House Bill 1261, which for the first time set greenhouse gas emission reduction targets for the state. We now have a goal of a 50% reduction below 2005 levels by 2030 and a 90% reduction by 2050. After the passage of that, the governor charged the Energy Office with leading an interagency effort to develop a greenhouse gas roadmap for the state that would really be the strategic plan for how the heck are we actually going to achieve the goals that we've now adopted. And pretty quickly, as we got into the analysis, it became clear that there were really 5 sectors that were responsible for most of the greenhouse gas pollution in the state. It was electricity generation, transportation, methane leaks from the oil and gas industry, industrial emissions, both from fuel use and direct industrial process emissions, and then fuel combustion in buildings. It also immediately became clear that electricity was going to be the tip of the spear for decarbonizing the economy. That when you looked at sort of the state of the technology and the state of the economics, that there were enormous opportunities for a rapid transition in the electricity generation sector. And that led to both legislative work that effectively set a target of an 80% reduction from electricity generation by 2030, which, as we've now seen, was too conservative. So as Tri-State and Xcel and other utilities have adopted their electric resource plans and clean energy plans, we're now on track for about an 85% reduction by 2030 across the electricity sector. And that's before taking into account any of the new sort of wind in the sails coming from the Inflation Reduction Act. I think it's going to be very interesting to look a couple of years out when the next electric resource plans are filed to see how much additional decarbonization we may see by 2030. So we're clearly on this track towards very deep decarbonization of electricity. And then using that clean electricity to replace direct combustion of fossil fuels in other sectors is key to achieving our economy-wide targets. And there's really a number of places where the administration has leaned in on that. One is certainly transportation electrification. The governor set a goal of just under 1 million EVs on the road by 2030. We've developed a clean trucking strategy that is focused on supporting the transition towards zero-emission vehicle trucks and buses on a slightly longer time frame than for light-duty vehicles, since the technology is a little bit behind. But we're seeing sort of great progress in that sector and all sorts of programs to support that. So in Colorado, we really are on a track towards having a lot of EVs on the road over the next decade. We've been seeing really rapid growth in EV sales. So we went from a couple of years ago, about 2% of the vehicles being sold in Colorado were EVs. We're now just under 10%. And we are number 5 in the country, basically the West Coast, and then Colorado, if you look at EV market share among new vehicle sales. The legislature created a bunch of programs to support investment in EV, both EV charging and then support for fleets to convert, including the passage of Senate Bill 260 to a year and a half ago in 2021, a big transportation funding bill that, as part of that infrastructure package, created new transportation electrification enterprises to invest in EV charging and to invest in supporting both bus electrification and fleet electrification. And collectively, those enterprises and the Colorado Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Fund will have about $850 million to invest over the decade in supporting EV adoption. In addition, back in 2019, there was legislation that passed requiring our investor-owned utilities to develop transportation electrification plans that support widespread electrification of transportation. Both Excel and Black Hills have their initial TEPs in place, and those also will lead to significant investment in both EV charging and various programs to support EV adoption. And again, I think we're going to see real wind in the sails coming from the Inflation Reduction Act. On the light-duty vehicle side, it's going to take a little while because of the domestic content requirements. But for commercial vehicles, there's no domestic content requirements. And those are the tax credits support both light-duty vehicle adoption by businesses and medium and heavy-duty, with essentially $40,000 per vehicle for heavy-duty zero-emission vehicles. We think there's going to be a lot of motion in that medium and heavy-duty electrification going forward. Major rulemaking that will actually be happening at our Air Quality Control Commission starting in December, where they're going to be considering adoption of an advanced clean truck standards that will require a growing market share of zero-emission vehicles coming from manufacturers selling medium and heavy-duty vehicles in Colorado, and that rulemaking process will be taking place throughout the spring. And then finally, I would note tons of action on the electric school bus side. And there's a lot of money coming from the federal government to support school bus electrification. Our legislature also, as part of the governor's air quality package, approved $65 million that will be available as grants for schools, both for school buses and for charging infrastructure. So I think a lot of opportunities to work with school districts. So that's sort of one piece of the using clean electricity to save people money and to clean up our environment is transportation. But buildings is definitely another big piece of it. And at this point, I would say we're a little bit agnostic on the question of are we electrifying everything, or are we or not? We're more focused on let's electrify everything that we can right now that makes sense, and let's learn from that and sort of figure out what that longer term future looks like. I would say that there is a really interesting study that the Energy Office is kicking off, working with a wide variety of stakeholders, from labor to utilities to environmental groups, to home builders, to really try to understand what the long-term future may look like, where we're going to be essentially modeling out a number of different scenarios for how do we achieve deep pollution reduction from the building sector, looking at sort of everything from full electrification to various hybrid scenarios where people may keep their gas systems but add heat pumps that are providing their heating for a good part of the year, and all the way to scenarios that focus more on the use of cleaner fuels like renewable natural gas, recovered methane, and green hydrogen, and try to understand the system level impacts of these different scenarios. So try to understand, what does it mean for the cost of the gas system? What does it mean for cost to consumers and owners of buildings? And what does it mean to the cost and reliability of the electric system? So trying to understand things like, what does it mean for our grid if we were to actually go to every building being heated with heat pumps? And what does that do to wintertime peak needs, and how would we address those? We're hopeful over the next year or so we're going to have some information that will be very useful for perhaps being able to have a better understanding of sort of what do those long-term trajectories look like. But we don't really need to answer that to get started. And there are a bunch of pieces of legislation over the last 2 years that I think have really sort of set the stage for getting started in this arena. There was legislation on beneficial electrification that applies to our investor-owned utilities that requires those IOUs to develop beneficial electrification programs, very much analogous to the demand-side management energy efficiency programs that they've had for many years, that would support customer adoption of a BE, and essentially require that all cost-effective measures be included in those programs, with cost-effectiveness designed to include benefits such as the sort of monetized value of the reduced pollution associated with moving to those electric appliances. So we're going to start to see, I think, some significant investments coming from the regulated utility sector to support beneficial electrification. We're, I think, going to see some focus on electrification coming out of the new building performance standards. So another piece of legislation requires commercial buildings over 50,000 square feet to report their energy use through the EPA Portfolio Manager tool, so that there will be publicly available information on energy use in large buildings. And that is being used to develop a building performance standard that has to achieve at least a 20% pollution reduction across the sector by 2030. There was a broad stakeholder task force that developed the proposed building performance standard structure that was released at the end of September, and will be going to our State Air Commission, which will be doing a rulemaking next year to adopt those building performance standards. And a lot of details still to be worked out, but the basic structure coming out of it is that there are sort of two ways that buildings can comply. One is through reducing their energy use intensity, so through energy efficiency investments. Another is through electrification, and any building that electrifies 80% of their heating load would essentially be considered to be in compliance with the standard. So I think that'll be another thing that will start to lead to more investments in electrification by those large buildings. A third thing that I think is a pretty important program was the passage of legislation the Clean Heat Plan legislation that really applies to our natural gas distribution utilities. And it set pollution reduction requirements for those distribution utilities where they will need to develop clean heat plans that for the ones that aren't municipal utilities go to the Public Utilities Commission for approval. And those clean heat plans allow them to use multiple measures, including reducing methane leaks on the gas distribution system, using cleaner fuels like green hydrogen or recovered methane in the distribution system, helping their customers improve their energy efficiency, and helping customers switch to beneficial electrification, all as tools for meeting those emissions reduction requirements. There's currently a rulemaking happening at our Public Utilities Commission to really establish the framework for these clean heat plans. And then the first plan from Xcel Energy will be going first, will be due later in the year. And while this is a technology neutral approach that allows multiple measures, we think it is likely that certainly for the dual fuel utilities like Xcel or Colorado Springs, that beneficial electrification will likely be an important element of those plans. I think it's also worth noting that the Public Utilities Commission, as part of looking at the clean heat planning, has also been looking more broadly at gas system planning in ways that I think will also have some impact on electrification. They are likely, they haven't made final decisions, but I think they are likely to require a greater level of scrutiny of new investments, especially new large investments in the gas system, require looking at things like, are there non-pipeline alternatives to doing this big investment in expanding pipelines? And they are considering removing an existing construction allowance that essentially uses ratepayer funds to pay for part of the cost of hooking up new buildings to the gas system. I think the PUC is really looking at that as a ratepayer protection mechanism, given the level of uncertainty that's out there about the future of the gas system versus electrification. But that would have, I think, some impact in terms of pushing people to think more about electrification going forward. So a lot happening in that sort of gas planning and clean heat planning arena. Then certainly another important piece of legislation that moved forward this last year was a bill on reducing GHG emissions from the building sector. That includes a couple of things. It includes some direct investments. So the Energy Office will have 2 new grant funding programs that will be opening in 2023. One of them will be focused on helping public buildings electrify, and it essentially will be a grant program largely focused on if a public building is going to, for instance, be doing an energy performance contract where they're trying to improve their energy efficiency, we would have grant funding to help them add in things like electric heat pumps as part of those energy efficiency upgrades. Or another program is focused on neighborhood scale electrification, and that's really going to be offering a relatively small number of grants of probably a few $1 million each to support programs that are focused on multiple buildings electrifying, to try to learn whether there's economies of scale there, and to try to look at nodes of the gas distribution system and see whether is it possible for us to avoid investment that would otherwise have to take place in upgrading part of the gas distribution system by electrifying multiple buildings that are on that node of the system. I think a very important thing to understand as we think about deep electrification and how to sort of minimize total system costs. So we want to get some experience with that. Both of those grant programs will be opening next spring. Another really important element of that bill is a focus on building codes. So Colorado is a local control state where individual jurisdictions adopt their building codes. We don't have a statewide building code. But we have, since I think 2007, had certain minimum requirements on local energy codes. So under the current law, anytime a local jurisdiction updates their building code, they have to assure that they have an energy code that is at least as strong as one of the last 3 versions of the International Energy Conservation Code. The new legislation updates that, and it created a state energy code board that has kind of broad representation that was just appointed at the end of September and had its first meeting Monday of this week. And that board is charged with doing a couple of things. The first is developing sort of minimum code requirements that will go into effect next July 1st that require, in any jurisdiction that's updating its building code will have to at least meet those minimum code requirements. That will include both the 2021 International Energy Conservation Code plus requirements that the code board needs to develop for making buildings solar ready and electric ready. And electric ready is defined both as EV ready and ready for building electrification. So that'll be a really important process sort of moving forward over the next, I guess it's about 8 months to develop those electric ready requirements. And there will certainly be opportunities for input into that process. There may well be people in this room who would want to provide input into what those requirements should look like. I think there's some really interesting questions we'll need to work through, especially for larger commercial buildings, to think through what does electric ready really look like in that context. And the next requirement on the codes board will be a little bit further out into the future, but they will be then developing what a low carbon code for the state that under statute needs to be based upon either the 2021 or 2024 International Energy Conservation Code and any appendices from either the 21 or 24 code. And it has to maximize carbon reductions consistent with maintaining housing affordability. So the codes board will really need to grapple with what's the appropriate balance there. The statute does require that low carbon code have pathways that will work either for all electric buildings or for dual fuel buildings. So it will, contrary to some claims we heard during the legislative process, it will not be banning gas in new buildings. It has to provide pathways for both. But certainly it is quite possible that the pathways for all electric may be easier to achieve deep carbon reductions. We won't really know until they get into the deliberations that will be taking place probably starting, about a year from now. And the new code requirements will go into effect in, I believe, 2026. The one other area that I think is worth mentioning is geothermal. And there's a lot of interest at state government right now in geothermal energy, both geothermal electricity production, but also geothermal heat pumps. We passed a piece of legislation this last session that creates a new grant fund to support geothermal. And it includes both funding for geothermal electricity grants, but also funding to support installation of geothermal heat pumps and funding to support planning and implementation of district heating geothermal systems for things like larger campuses. The governor has also convened the Western Governors Association, which he's chair of this year, to focus on what he's calling the Heat Beneath Our Feet initiative, which is really looking at both what are the obstacles to more widespread deployment of geothermal and what can we be doing to fix those obstacles? And so that process is moving forward right now, and there will be a set of recommendations coming out both for the federal government and for states across the West on how to better support geothermal going forward. One of the reasons that we're really interested in geothermal heat pumps is thinking about a future of really widespread electrification, and what does that mean for the peak electricity needs on the coldest days in the middle of the winter. And because geothermal heat pumps are always working off of about a 50-degree reservoir in the ground, their peak needs are going to be substantially less. And if everything goes on air source heat pumps, we're very interested in understanding more about the potential for much wider spread deployment of geothermal heat pumps going forward. Would also note, last year there was legislation that created a state tax credit for heat pumps. It's a 10% income tax credit, and then also includes an exemption for the state portion of sales and use tax on heat pumps. And then, the last thing that I'll close with and then open it up to questions is, we are very excited at the Energy Office about all of the new federal programs and the level of the federal investment that we're going to see to support many, many things in the realm of electrification. Two of the programs that he's mentioned earlier this morning are the Homes program, and then I can never think of the acronym for the electrification funding. But our projections are that the Energy Office will receive somewhere between 125 and 140 million collectively for those two programs, and will then need to be developing those rebate programs. We don't have really any information from U.S. Department of Energy at this time about what the timeline is in which they're going to get those funds out. And DOE is pretty overwhelmed. They're still trying to get out all of the funding from the Infrastructure Act. So, I suspect that it won't be super fast, but we don't know what that timeline looks like. And still a process moving forward, I think, to determine how much flexibility states will have and how many sort of additional details the DOE may try to put into place. But we're really very excited about setting up those programs once we learn a little bit more about what the federal requirements will be and what that federal timeline will be. And we're also sort of very excited about those federal investments in transportation electrification, and in particular with the fact that those investments are direct pay tax credits, which means that public entities are able to access them. So that rural, cooperative electric utilities will be able to access them. Local governments will be able to access them in ways that weren't the case in the past with previous tax credits. So we're very excited about working with a wide variety of stakeholders to try to maximize the amount of that federal investment that comes here to Colorado. And with that, I will just throw it open to questions. Yeah.
Hi, thanks, Will. It's so good to see you out and about. We were worried about the future of our electrification here in Colorado without you. I'm Kirsten Millar. I'm with Virtual Peaker. Going off that last point you made, I'm considering the leadership that we have here in Colorado. Is there this collaborative nature across state energy offices to kind of equip others that may not be as far along, or does it feel a little bit competitive to get these this funding? I think some of them are formula grants from the feds. So are you all working with other states and helping them through this? Thanks.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So we are working in a couple of different ways with other states on this. One is through NASEO, the National Association of State Energy Offices, which has representation from every state energy office and has been very engaged in working with the federal agencies and was very engaged on the legislative front in trying to make sure that the legislation that moved forward, was implementable by states. And so lots of conversation with states from sort of all across the spectrum on making things work through NASIO. Many of the programs are formula programs. So, when it comes, for instance, to all of that rebate funding, that's going to be formula funding. So there's not really competition among the states. I'd say there's a lot of collaborative discussion about how best to structure those state programs and about what feedback to be giving to DOE to make sure that the DOE rules will allow effective administration by states. Then when it comes to the various competitive grants that are out there, we are certainly collaborating with other states on some of them. So Colorado is working on a regional hydrogen hub, and the governor signed a memorandum of understanding with New Mexico, Wyoming, and Utah to work together on that, which I have to say was a huge step forward in terms of our relationship with some of those states on energy. And it's really great to be working collaboratively, for instance, with a state like Wyoming in ways that were different than maybe than our relationship a couple of years ago. Yeah. So the federal tax credits will not be. That will be, but yes, the home funding and the electrification rebates will be coming through the energy office. So we're pretty early in that process, given that we don't yet know timeline or federal guidelines. But we're certainly very interested in working with stakeholders to think through sort of different ways that this could be structured, because it's going to be a big new program that we're going to be administering, and we do want to get it right.
Thanks, Will. That was loud. Patricia Rothwell, the Energy Efficiency Business Coalition. Just to follow on to your question about the stakeholder input and when that, do you have any idea timing-wise when we should be looking to be in communication? Should we be reaching out now or December or, any ideas on that?
I think it'll probably be early next year will be when we'll really be looking for input. I mean, we can certainly take input before then. But again, until we know a little bit more from the Department of Energy, it's going to be a little, maybe less productive conversations, and once we know a little bit more.
Is there someone specifically we should direct our input or get engaged with to get ready for that?
So we are going to be hiring a new position, so can't give you a name yet.
Thank you. We're excited, so thanks.
And if you're interested in engaging on the building codes issue, this guy right here, Adam Berry, who recently came from Washington, D.C., where he helped to work on the details of the Inflation Reduction Act, especially around buildings, is now running our building codes efforts. And so he's the person you can direct that input to.
Dave Roberts from National Renewable Energy Laboratory. Good to see you on your feet and out and about, Will. You mentioned a study just launching on built environment decarb sort of roadmap. How can I find out more? How can I?
Yeah, so I would say if you sent an email to Keith Hay, our policy director, he would be the right person for questions on that.
So, excuse me. I help operate a local HVAC company. One of our biggest challenges is finding good qualified employees. Are there plans in place to help with vocational training so we can gather more employees, good qualified employees to help with this? Because it's going to be a lot of work, right?
Yeah, yeah, no, great question. We're sort of very concerned about the workforce challenges. And there is some of the funding that will be coming from the IRA can support workforce development. And there's also some funding from inflation, or from the Infrastructure Act that can support workforce development. So we are sort of in active conversations right now. We don't have any new programs to announce, but are trying to sort of figure out what's the most effective way of trying to get some of those funds to directly support workforce development. Because we constantly hear about the challenges. Our own weatherization program is constantly running into the challenges with workforce. And I think we all, in addition to workforce, think sort of training for contractors and support is going to be important, because we certainly hear a lot of stories about folks who aren't yet familiar with heat pumps trying to talk customers out of buying heat pumps, that even when the customer comes in knowing that that's what they want. So we know that there's a lot of challenges in that area. All right. Well, thank you very much.